Hello, everyone from across the world. It is great to have those of you who've come for other ones to be back for our 8th Wharton Ready Livecast series. Today, I'm particularly excited to introduce you to Professor Michael Roberts, who will speak to us about financial management during the crisis and beyond. But for those of you who are new, let me point out how we manage this. It's going to be a half an hour of presentation and Q&A, and then an additional 15 minutes of another topic. And if you have questions, please orient yourself to the right-hand panel where you'll see the Q&A button. Populate questions throughout the session. Our question and answer moderator, Ed Thierry, will stop the presentation of Professor Roberts about 20 minutes in, and we'll have time for questions, so please keep those coming. If you have any technical difficulty, please use the other icon 2 up from that, which is the silhouette of a man. That is the one to communicate if you're having technical difficulties. And as I said, this is our 8th in a series. Professor Roberts is one of our outstanding faculty in finance at Wharton, who does a particularly special job in executive education. Many of you will be returning students who have seen him and understand why Michael Roberts continually gets 4.95s and 5.0s when he teaches, because he delivers extreme value. So with that, Michael, I pass it over to you. Thank you.
Mike, thanks for the generous introduction there. So let me start by saying it's a pleasure to be here with everyone today. I hope everyone is safe and well. Let me start the presentation with 2 questions that have been popping up in virtually every conversation I've had with executives over the last couple of months. First of which pertains to what I'll broadly call survival. What do I do to make it through the crisis? And really at this point, or at this stage of the crisis, the question is what I am currently doing optimal? Should I be doing something else? Should I be doing things differently? The other question relates to what I'll call positioning. What do I do to prepare for after the crisis and the new normal, whatever that new normal may be? So what I want to do in this talk for the next 15 or 20 minutes is really focus on how you can assess your options. In other words, which strategies, which operational changes, which financial decisions are best for you. And I want to emphasize that I want to help enable you better assess your options, because no one knows your company, your situation as well as you. And so think of this talk as one that's going to provide some insight, some information to help you make better decisions. And we're going to do that with 3 messages that I want to convey. First, we need to simplify our decision making. So information is coming at us incredibly quickly. Circumstances are changing daily. And so it's very easy to become overwhelmed in the current environment. So we need to go back to basics and simplify the decision-making process. And we're going to do that by focusing on short-term cash flow, really shoring up our liquidity position. And I'll explain why that's so critical in just a couple of slides. And I want to close the talk with a more optimistic note, though hopefully the whole talk is somewhat optimistic, thinking about some opportunities that arise in the current crisis and in past crises as well, that we can take advantage of to set us up not just for performance during the crisis, but for whatever comes thereafter. Now, before I move on to the rest of the talk, I'd be remiss if I didn't acknowledge the dozens of former students, alumni, executive education participants, and colleagues who have helped contribute thoughts and ideas to this presentation. I want to thank them. I also want to put forth a caveat. I don't know what's going to happen or how things are going to unfold. And so I want to take what we're going to discuss today and more broadly your decision making by explicitly recognizing that uncertainty. Okay, so let's start off with simplifying our decision making. And I really want to go back to basics and make sure we all have the same fundamental framework for making decisions. And that is, financial value is ultimately just the sum of cash flow that we're going to get in the future. We get money tomorrow in the short term, and we get money thereafter in the long term. So it's a useful taxonomy. right? Short-term cash flow and long-term cash flow. And what short-term versus long-term is, whether it's 6 months and beyond or it's 5 years and beyond, depends upon your particular company. The point is that good decision making ultimately identifies the cash flow implications of the decisions, and it recognizes the uncertainty and plans for contingencies when those expectations or forecasts don't pan out. Now, what happens in a crisis is the emphasis shifts. The framework's the same. Value ultimately comes down to cash flow in the future. But good decision making in a crisis is all about identifying the cash flow implications right now. Short-term cash flow is paramount in a crisis. And we still need to recognize the uncertainty around even short-term cash flow and be able to plan for contingency when next week, next month's earnings don't pan out. Now, where am I getting this? Why is this coming up? So what I've been doing over the last couple of weeks is trying to understand how value drivers change over the business cycle, and in particular around crises. So the question I asked is, how do value drivers change from before a crisis hits, during a crisis, to after a crisis? And so let me focus your attention on what I'll call small firms. I'm talking about firms with annual revenues of around $60 million a year, a broad range around that number. If you look at what's driving their value before a crisis, it's two things. It's revenue growth and investment. Either you're growing right now or you're investing for growth in the future. And that's not terribly surprising. Interestingly, financial leverage, so think of debt, that acts as a bit of a drag on value for these small firms because what happens is it quashes that growth. Now, as we transition into a crisis, what matters for value changes a bit. Revenue growth and investment is still important for value, but now financial leverage becomes a value driver as opposed to a value drag. That's due in large part to the market recognizing that small firms are going to need to tap external capital resources to maintain growth, and more importantly, to shore up liquidity. What comes in screaming in my analysis is that liquidity, think earnings, cash balances, working capital efficiency, so days payable, days receivable, inventory turns. This is critical for financial value in a crisis. And then as we exit the crisis, post-crisis era, again, revenue growth and investment as always, financial leverage turns back to a value drag because it may slow down our growth, but liquidity is still important because the market's still worried about a double dip or slow recovery. So we can see very clearly for small firms the importance of liquidity in a crisis and its persistence thereafter. If we look at larger firms, things are somewhat different, right? Revenue growth is important across the board, but liquidity tends to be important across the board as well, and financial leverage turns out to be a drag in a crisis because it's very easy for large firms, or easier relative to small firms, to load up on debt and then exit the crisis with that excess debt load stifling growth, right? Large firms just have a very different growth trajectory, and too much debt can be problematic because they can't grow their way out of that overhead. So in a nutshell, what this slide and analysis is showing is that what we focus our attention on changes over the business cycle, and in particular in the depths of a crisis. Liquidity starts to become paramount. Now, I want to shift a little bit and go a little bit deeper on what we just discussed and talk about what do I mean by shoring up near-term cash flow? What should we be doing? How should we be thinking about? And I want to start with a picture that shows how uncertainty has been changing throughout the crisis. So this figure shows over the last few months what's been happening to the volatility index, the VIX. And we can think very loosely of the VIX as a measure of economic uncertainty. So before the crisis, the VIX was relatively stable, economic uncertainty was low. Towards the end of March, early April, we see that the VIX increased more than fourfold. Uncertainty just skyrocketed. Now, that uncertainty has been coming down over the last month and a half, But even today, economic uncertainty is more than twice as high as what it was before the crisis. Now, what does that uncertainty mean for us? Well, it means we've got to pay close attention to what's going on with our cash flow. And what that means from a practical standpoint, we need to be monitoring cash flow much more frequently on a daily, if not or a weekly basis, and at a much more granular level. Look, it's very easy for information to get lost in aggregation. So to give you an example, what are your days payable, days receivable for different accounts? Rather than looking at just an aggregated net days, break it out by accounts and payables and receivables. Let's understand how different product is turning over in our inventory, if it even is. And so this monitoring becomes much, much more important, frequency and granularity. A question I like to ask all executives at all times, but particularly in a crisis, is how long is your liquidity runway? And so what I've done here is I've taken for a large group of firms of really SaaS businesses. So this is software as a service businesses, which is a specific business model, but which is nice because it spans a large number of industries. We have companies from healthcare, consumer retail, travel, you name it. Okay. I took this sample of firms, and what I did is I computed how much cash they have, cash and short-term marketable securities, as a fraction of their annual expenses. And I asked how much liquidity they have to cover these annual expenses. And I grouped them into buckets, 3 buckets. That's what these runways, so to speak, represent, which look actually a little bit more like streets when I look at it. So on the left of the slide, you'll see we've got companies that have 1.5 months worth of their annual expenses stored up in cash, broadly defined, cash broadly defined. In the middle, we've got companies with about 4.6, almost 5 months of expenses stored up in cash. And on the right-hand side, we've got the sort of cash-rich firms with almost a year's worth of expenses stored up in cash. And what I asked is, if you look at these 3 groups of firms and these cash positions coming out of the 2008 recession, how did they perform over the 2 years after the end of that crisis? Now, I want to be clear, the Great Recession that happened from the end, I guess it was December 2007 to June 2009, that recession is obviously quite different in many ways from what we're experiencing today, both in terms of depths and, as we'll see, dynamics. But there's still a number of lessons to be learned from that recession, which was actually the deepest recession we've had since the Great Depression. And I'll touch on some differences as we move forward. Okay, so looking at these 3 groups of firms and these 3 different liquidity positions, how did they perform coming out of that Great Recession? So if you look at the left, and use my little pointer here, on the left, you can see these firms with relatively little cash actually had an annualized stock return over the 2 years following the end of the recession of 33%, which looks unbelievably good, but don't forget, the market as a whole did incredibly well over the following years after the end of the Great Recession. So they had an average annual return of about 33%, and they had improvements in market multiples, sales and EBIT, enterprise value and sales and enterprise value to EBITDA of around 0.3 and 0.1. If I go over to the other side, we actually see somewhat similar post-crisis performance for firms that were sitting on a lot of cash relative to their annual expenses. Annual stock returns of about 30%, and changes in enterprise value to sales of about 0.9 and 0.20. But if we look at this middle group of firms, these firms that had about 5 months, I'm rounding, but about 5 months of expenses locked up in cash, short-term marketable securities, we see that they had annualized stock returns of 53%. And improvements in market multiples of 1.3 and 5.4, significantly better than firms who are light on the cash or heavy on the cash. And so the message here, that the general message is really one of a Goldilocks story. You don't want to lock away too much cash. And you don't want to lock away too little cash relative to your expenses coming out of a crisis. because you're going to pass up, potentially, too many good growth opportunities. So it's really about striking the right balance when it comes to your liquidity position in order to position yourself for growth at the end of the crisis. Now, we have to be a little bit careful here. Which number here is right for your particular circumstances is going to depend. It may not be 4.6 months because of your growth profile, your industry, what's going on in your sector. Think about what's happening right now, right? Sectors are being hit incredibly differently in this crisis, right? We can think of healthcare and software as really booming. But of course, other sectors such as travel and entertainment as being hit quite hard. So the relative cash position, optimal cash position across these sectors is going to vary dramatically. And it's really up to you to strike that right balance. The broader point is too much, too little, not so good. Another aspect of the short-term cash flow position that we really need to emphasize in the crisis is risk. And so I want to think about de-risking our operations in the crisis. So what I've done here is I've grouped firms into two buckets. Firms that reduce their operating leverage, so think of fixed cost to variable cost. Firms that reduce their operating leverage in the previous crisis, so of 2008, and firms that increased it. And operating leverage is important because we can think of fixed cost as being akin to financial debt. They increase cash flow volatility and they increase risk. So what's interesting in this table, if you take a look, is that the changes in the 2 years after the crisis in firms' enterprise value to sales or enterprise value to EBITDA multiples was roughly the same across these two buckets. In other words, whether you reduced your operating risk or increased it had relatively little effect on your valuation multiple over the subsequent 2 years after the crisis ended. But what I found fascinating was it had a huge effect on your stock return, which is ultimately what matters. And it had an effect in almost a counterintuitive way. The firms that reduced their operating leverage actually had an annualized stock return over the subsequent 2 years following the crisis of 40%, whereas the firms that increased their operating leverage had a stock return of only 28%. And again, remember, the market was doing quite well at this time. So the key fact to keep in mind is the comparison of these two. Now, I say that that's somewhat counterintuitive because less risk, less return. But what's happening, if you look a little bit deeper, is the firms that were able to reduce their operating leverage had significantly greater sales growth, 16% on a per annum basis, relative to 9% for those that increased their operating leverage. And the profitability grew dramatically more for firms that reduced their operating risk relative to the firms that increased their operating risk. And so that's what's driving that stock return differential. Getting a hold or a grip in containing your operating risk really seems to pay dividends after the crisis has ended. And the reason why is because you're in a much better position, coupled with a better liquidity position, to take advantage of those growth opportunities that are going to come out of the crisis. All right, so let me turn to some opportunities to close the conversation before we turn to the Q&A. And I'm going to start with a picture that I love to share with my students. On the horizontal axis of this graph is time, and I've chunked it up into good economic times and bad economic times. Obviously, right now we're in the red zone, bad economic times, but this too shall pass, and we will come out into good economic times again. Now, precisely when and what those good economic times will look like is unclear, though the current thinking, at least by economic experts and many, is that we're in a bit of a swoosh. So it's going to be a slow, gradual, and protracted recovery. So horizontal axis is is economic times. Vertical axis is what I like to call financial leakage. And financial leakage is just that value loss that comes from undisciplined decision making. So it's best to discuss that in the context of economic times. So if you look on the left side of the picture, when we're in good economic times, financial leakage tends to be high, right? We're focused on top line revenue growth. Times are good. We're making money. We're less concerned about wasteful spending. A crisis hits, we move into bad economic times, and discipline ramps up, financial leakage plummets, and we're very careful with our spend and our resources. But then good economic times come back, we slide back into old habits, and financial leakage starts ramping. Now is an opportunity to really discipline decision making and change the norm, right? We want to carry the disciplined decision making and the processes we instill today in the crisis through with us once we move out of this crisis. So yes, emphasis is going to shift back to top line revenue growth, but we want to maintain that discipline. And I want to emphasize, it's very easy to think, well, when you talk about financial discipline, you just mean less spend or no spend. And that's not what I'm talking about at all. Discipline means efficient spend, maximizing return for each dollar spent. And that might mean more spend in certain situations. So think efficiency. And I'm going to end with a bit of an anecdote, prefaced with a broader message. Okay? In bad times, growth and earnings expectations have decreased, if not gone by the wayside. And so now is the time to implement all those ideas, all those cleanup, all those efficiency ideas that maybe are less focused on top line revenue growth, but are really about streamlining the organization, streamlining operations, and getting more bang for the buck. And so a great example was a recent conversation I had with the CEO of a multinational manufacturing firm, a former student of mine. Participant, executive education participant to be more precise. And he was thinking about this large legacy accounting and audit department. The company has been doing well for almost 12 years. Revenue growth has been steady. Profits have been going up. And so there hasn't been much thought put into streamlining the organization. And one particular area that caught his attention was this legacy accounting and audit department that was a large fixed cost, a lot of FTEs. And he was thinking now is perhaps the time to move this to a scalable, automated environment, which would accomplish two goals. One, it reduces cost, which is obviously helpful, but more importantly, it reduces the fixity of costs, offers more flexibility for the firm, reduces operating leverage and risk. And so he's really accomplishing two goals with this one potential move. So something for you to think about in these times is thinking about really bringing up operations and thinking about efficiency that can carry through not just in the crisis, but beyond as well. So instead of conclusions, let me end with some questions that you should be thinking about and that you should really be able to answer at this point or very soon. Number one, how much money is coming and going over the next 6, 12, or 24 months? And I'm thinking 24 months because, as I mentioned just a moment ago, this swoosh notion, and I'm thinking Nike swoosh, not to give a shout out to Nike per se, but this sort of protracted recession that we may find ourselves in is going to require some serious capital budgeting over a fairly extended period of time. So how much money is coming and going over that time frame? From where is it coming, and with what certainty? What are your backup plans in case of shortfalls? And the second group of questions we need to be focused on is, can you clearly convey or articulate the cash flow implications of your decisions? Do you have contingency plans when expectations don't pan out? Because you really shouldn't expect that they will, given the uncertainty that I showed you and discussed earlier. We just don't know what's going to happen over the next week, much less 6 months to a year. What is your risk exposure in light of the current cash flow forecast? Can you weather downturns, and potential surprises. And one question I love to ask students is the following. Assess what you're doing and ask, what if we don't do Project X? What if we stop doing it? Think through the implications because they're often incredibly insightful. And I say that not because the expectation is that you'll come to the conclusion, oh, we don't need to do this. But rather, sometimes the conclusion is, this is critical. We need to reallocate more resources to this project, to this initiative. So it can be an incredibly useful thought and quick thought experiment to undertake, not just in crisis times, but really at all times. All right, so I see I'm running a little bit short on time. What I want to do now is I want to actually hand it over to my colleague, Ed Sierri, and see if there are any questions or comments that we can address. So, Ed?
Great. Thank you very much, Michael. We do have time for a couple questions. A lot of good ones coming in. We'll get to those in 1 second. Just want to remind everyone that we will be following up with a link to the recording and the PDF versions of today's slides. I know some of you have been asking about those. So Michael, let's get to the questions while we have time. So the lessons that you went over, do they apply to companies that are performing well during a crisis? For example, maybe in e-commerce during the COVID-19 crisis?
So they do, but they do differently. In other words, if I think about what the market is starting to deem as winners during this crisis, one of which is obviously e-commerce, tech, and healthcare, right? The growth opportunities in the crisis are much greater. And so clearly there's less need to pack away liquidity when you've got that cash flow from that increased revenue. But I would warrant caution, and this brings me back to the Goldilocks slide. You need to strike the right balance. You don't want to grow your way out of cash flow, have a hiccup later on, and then run into trouble. So take advantage of the growth opportunities, but be mindful that it doesn't necessarily mean all in at this standpoint. It's really about striking the right balance. And so while you'll need less cash reserves as an e-commerce company than say, a retailer or a manufacturer, it doesn't mean simply riding on a razor thin edge of liquidity. Find the right balance.
Great. So Michael, what are some of the most common mistakes or pitfalls that financial leaders make when reacting to a crisis like this?
Yeah. So I think panic often leads to bad decision making, which in the context of financial management it can be too easy to cut. Right? The immediate reaction in a crisis is to slash and burn. And while inevitably, cutting expenses and thinking about removing overhead is critical, cutting at all costs can backfire quite quickly. And I mean that in the sense of missed opportunity, okay, and actually bad will with your customers. So, my marketing colleagues would always say, be careful. You have to maintain customer centricity. If you cut too much so that you are actually hurting services that you're providing to your customer, you're potentially hurting the revenue on which you're dependent. So again, striking the right balance between streamlining and becoming more efficient without sacrificing the service and products you're providing to your customers is really critical in a crisis.
Michael, do you have any insights on the post-crisis performance of companies that pursued inorganic growth opportunities during crisis, performed in relation to liquidity, debt levels during the crisis?
Yeah, certainly. Obviously, the firms that are able to grow, be it through organic growth or strategic acquisitions, though the acquisition market tends to shut down in bad times, so that's really much less of an issue, especially today. So focusing mostly on the organic growth, those firms that are able to capitalize on organic growth are obviously much better positioned coming out of the crisis along any observable metric, be it stock return or multiples. The questions that need to be asked are twofold. One, do you have those opportunities? And two, can you take advantage of them without risking your liquidity and solvency during the crisis. And so, I wish I could give a nice quantitative rule of thumb to say you need to hold X percent of cash in reserve and have X percent of spend on growth initiatives. But I don't, because it varies so dramatically by sector and even within sector by firm. Because if I think about e-commerce, there's an enormous amount of heterogeneity even within e-commerce, depending upon your scale and your niche within the market. So bottom line is, now's not the time to shut down that eye towards top line revenue growth. If you have that opportunity, just be mindful of your liquidity position. Monitor it frequently and plan for potential shortfalls.
Great, Michael. We're going to end with one final question, the one that has had one of the most upvotes from the participants. So that question is, maximum companies are out of cash. They are more dependent on client or legal claims to reimburse for the pandemic. They have expensed out maximum cash available with them. So construction industry is facing the worst cash crunch they ever had. How to revive it? Any specific tips or golden rules for that particular one?
So is the question how to revive the company? Can you just clarify a little bit, Ed?
So maximum companies are out of cash. They are more dependent on client or legal claims to reimburse for the pandemic. They have expensed out maximum cash available with them. So construction industry is facing the worst cash crunch they ever had. How to revive it? Any specific tip or golden rules? I guess that would be towards that particular field.
So the question is how as I understand, what are the companies that are hardest hit? What can they be doing now? And honestly, they have to be making the hard decisions. I know that sounds obvious, and it's perhaps a somewhat disappointing answer, or just reinforcing what you already know. But for the companies that are particularly hard hit and cash strapped, now is the time to find resources wherever you can. So the question mentioned, whether it's legal claims or it's customers, can you get credit at banks? One big difference between what's going on now and what happened in the 2008 crisis is the financial sector is, in a relative sense, is much healthier when compared to the 2008 crisis. Is now the time to meet with your local banker to see if you can work out a line of credit? Is there a way to work out terms with customers? The problem, what always worries me about legal remedies is that the biggest winners of legal remedies are lawyers. So, the question is do the potential benefits of legal remedies outweigh the costs? That's a tough question, and one that needs to be made in the particular context that you're dealing with. But ultimately, it's about finding cash flow in any way, shape, or form that you can to survive. That's it. And I wish I had better answers, but it ultimately boils down to you identifying those immediate cash flow opportunities.
Great, Michael. Thank you for ending on that tough question there. So at this point, I would like to bring back our Associate Vice Dean, Mike Malafakis, for some additional thoughts with Michael at this point. So, Mike?
Thank you, Michael, so much for a really powerful 30 minutes. And I'm always amazed at how many insights and how much value you can distill within a 30-minute session. And although it's directed at the immediate needs that companies are facing right now, there are many long-term implications that you laid out there too. And I'd like to ask you, really pivoting, you all see on this screen, Professor Roberts, Michael has been doing not only teaching about this, but thinking about this and thinking about what is needed. And we hope you found this 30 minutes valuable. We'll take a couple of minutes to dive into the new session and the new program that Michael Roberts is designing that will be launched next month. And Professor Roberts, if those of you who've seen him before know, he's the academic director of two of our most popular executive education courses. That's Corporate Valuation and Wharton Finance for Executives. And Michael, just tell us why now is the time for this new program you've designed. What motivated you to take the time to make this happen?
Sure. Thanks, Mike. And thank you to everyone who tuned in for today's talk. I appreciate the time. So, thoughtful financial management is always important. But it's even more so in a crisis because there's fewer resources, there's fewer customers, there's less cash flow, there's less financing. And so the implications of decision making in a crisis are amplified. The consequences of bad decisions are much more severe. And the current environment, I think, really bears these facts quite clearly. And so we, and by we I mean my colleagues and I at Wharton, we need to ensure that executives are well armed with the knowledge and information that they need to make the best decisions both now as well as going into the future. And that's what motivated this program.
Given that we're still social distancing and staying safe, how are you designing this? What's different in this course than the other ones you've typically been leading over the last few years?
Sure. So I think there's really two broad ways in which this program is going to be different to meet the needs, the current needs of executives. And those two ways are, one, the format, and two, the content. So let me just focus on the format, and you can remind me to go back to the content in case I forget. So regarding the format, well, the virtual aspect, that's obvious. But we wanted a 1 hour duration, sort of a tight duration, because now, executives' time is at a premium. There's just no time for reflection. And so we wanted a compact piece of time, and we wanted to be able to distill information into the essentials so that business leaders could turn what we're discussing into actionable items as quickly and as efficiently as possible. We chose 12 p.m. Eastern time to maximize the availability of the program, regardless of one's geographic region, whether it's start of the day out on the West Coast, lunchtime on the East Coast, end of day in Europe, or late night, perhaps very late night in Asia. And so we wanted to design a program that was timely, topical, and could reach as many people as possible while respecting their time and their current circumstances.
That sounds ideal for these times we're living in. And in terms of content, can you give us just a little more flavor for the content that will be covered?
Yeah, no
it's going to be very actionable and topical.
Yeah, that's right. So the program's focused on two aspects of business dynamics, now and after. Now, during the crisis, and after the crisis. And so at the end of the day, we're really trying to help executives make better decisions. Now, how we're going to do that is by covering a broad range of topics, really in a broad range of settings. And so what I've done is I've assembled really some of the best colleagues I have here at Wharton to cover a range of topics. Let me just give you a sampling of a couple. We're going to talk about general financial management during a crisis and after. So really building on what I've touched upon today. We'll talk about how markets and investors are responding to the crisis and to what managers are doing. We'll talk about how firms' cost of capital is shifting, how that affects their decision making, how to forecast KPIs in uncertain times, and how innovation and entrepreneurship has to change during a crisis, all while recognizing how the pandemic is affecting things on a macro scale and why these macroeconomic effects are relevant for business leaders at specific companies.
Thank you. That's a powerful toolkit during these times. And For the audience, as I said, it's amazing what you can do in 30 minutes. So keeping these tight hour-long sessions will be highly valuable. But who did you have in mind when you were designing this? Who can most benefit from this? What type of audience? What type of executive?
I mean, at a broad level, corporate decision makers, which if you take it literally, that's everyone. So let me try and pare that down. But the people I'm thinking about are people who are responsible for a P&L, people who are responsible for a budget, people who are managing a team, executives whose decisions have significant implications on their business unit, on their company, all the way up to the C-suite even. And so that's really the target audience that we're going after here. It's a large, broad group, but it's one that I think will benefit substantially from the information and knowledge we hope to convey in this program.
That's great. Thank you again for taking the time during these critical months we're living in to design something new. And on a parting note, what excites you most about this course?
I think the opportunity to help people. There's just a lot of uncertainty, fear, if I may say, about what's going on now and what may happen. And I think we have an opportunity, we as in Wharton have an opportunity to allay some of those fears, to help business leaders help themselves, help their company, help their employees and their families by giving them information and knowledge that's going to make a difference. And so as an academic, as an instructor, that's really exciting. That opportunity to help people now is really important.
That is so great. Thank you, Michael, for articulating, I think, what motivates all of us at Wharton, not just faculty, but staff as well. We are a mission-driven organization, and not just an educational mission, but what we are furthering is hopefully bettering your responses to these critical times. So Michael, thank you so much for taking time with us today. Really appreciate it. Look forward to seeing you start the program in June, and hope some of you can join and spread the word. And please join us again next week from around the globe for next Tuesday's Wharton Ready Livecast, which is a completely different topic, but it will be the building a smarter supply chain, lessons from COVID-19. So again, the purpose of these is to bring you thought leadership from Wharton faculty on various topics that are relevant today. And once again, those of you who've been joining us weekly, great to see you. Hopefully some new people will see us again next week. And thank you all. Safe journey and much success in the upcoming months. Thank you.